Today, I'm going to read the prologue from the Gospel of John. Over the next months, we will revisit the Gospel of John off and on, and you will discover that it is my favorite Gospel because I think it has insights that are particularly, they connect to us in a modern world. So I'm going to read about the Logos. You will see in a moment when I put the text up that the New Revised Standard Version is right in front of you, except where it says word, I've written Logos, which is the Greek word for word. And that's because Logos is more than just word, and I wanted to say a brief bit about that. When John used the word Logos, some would say that Logos holds all of the philosophical content of the entire Greek language, the foundations of its understanding of what creation is. That's not the only reason. You remember that in the first chapter of Genesis, God created with word. And so Logos is also supposed to take up this sense of a dynamic, creative God that's operating in creation. And finally, if I were to read to you from Proverbs chapter 8 about wisdom, Chachma, you would notice some real similarities between the two passages, Proverbs 8 and John 1, where wisdom is there at the beginning, a co-creator with God. All of that is held in John's prologue when he says, in the beginning was the Logos. So with that, I'm going to read my own translation, and you can follow along the NRSV to figure out if I've been honest or not. Listen for the word of God that it may speak to you, for the Spirit is holy and touches us. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was oriented towards God. The Logos was God. He was in the beginning oriented towards God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being with him is life, and the life was the light of all people. That light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man who was sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness to testify to this light so that all might believe that through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light which enlightens everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, and yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who received him, who trusted in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of flesh or of the will of human beings, but of God. And the Logos became enfleshed and made camp among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a parent's only son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me. From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and trust came through Jesus the Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the parent's heart, who has made God known." Spirit of God, we ask that you will open our hearts and give us wisdom as we seek to understand your word. Well, you have to say that the human condition leaves a little something to be desired, wouldn't you? Let's take the words, "I love you." Ideally, "I love you" would mean what? I care about you, I'm interested in making sure that we are close and caring with one another. Maybe even I'm willing to sacrifice something of myself so that you can become whole and complete. This would be love. But let's face it, more often than not, it means I'm really glad you're filling my needs right now. And we may not even want it to be that way, but that is sometimes the way it is. Most of you know that I was married to a woman named Debbie who died of breast cancer. She was sick for 10 years. And we went to support groups and test after test and treatment after treatment. It kind of defined our relationship. And we learned some things in these support groups. We learned about what I call the Newt Gingrich syndrome. Some of you may or may not know that when Gingrich's wife was in chemotherapy, he served her divorce papers. Now that might sound outrageous, except for the fact that it's extraordinarily common. It seems what happens to people when there's long-term cancer is couples tend to strain and pull apart. And it can happen even if you don't want it to. I know it happened to me and Deb. The last time she came downstairs and said, I found another lump, I knew we were looking at the end. It had been a long time. And if I really loved her, I'm sure the first thing I would have done is just focused on her and how she felt and her fears and all of that. And I probably did give her a hug and say, oh, honey, I'm sorry, but I'll tell you what I was thinking. How am I going to raise these boys without her income? I mean, she was the major breadwinner in our home. What am I going to do? How am I going to figure it out? And to be honest with you, I could not really focus on Deb and Deb's issues until I had solved some of those problems in my own heart and my own mind. Now, we did come together. We were there to the end. We were close. We did manage to be with each other in the midst of it. But I love you? I think maybe I felt short. Now, I can forgive myself. I did better than some and worse than others. But the reality is there are limits to what human beings can pull off. My pastoral care professor would tell me that it was all about human finitude. Sam, you're a human being. There's just so much you can take. Calvin would say, well, that's human depravity for you. You may have heard Calvin's issues with human depravity. Some people misunderstand that. They think Calvin was saying that human beings are depraved all the time in every way and everything they do. That's not what he meant at all. What he meant was that the seeds of depravity exist in every human person, given the right circumstances. We fall short. It's the human condition. We see it in other ways. We can certainly see it in our, collective crowd behavior. When you're in a crowd, human beings could lose their individuality and become anonymous. And when they become anonymous and they become identified with this crowd, they put up with lies. They exert power and force over other people in violent ways. Justice goes out the window. It's just the way human beings work, apparently, in the midst of a crowd, when things are tense and people are afraid. Now, some of you may be thinking, oh, there Sam goes again, talking about Donald Trump. And I suppose Donald is a decent example, but let's not let the liberals off the hook. This is all humanity that does this. I have a good friend, his name's Mark. He's a spiritual teacher. And 5 years ago on Christmas morning, there was a hit piece written about him in the New York Times. It said a bunch of things about him. Most of it was sexual misconduct and whatnot. And the thing is that I learned that there is fake news in the New York Times because I know for a fact that many of the things that were said were just plain wrong. I also know that it was an author that had been put up to writing the piece. And the other thing that happened was that it became the first thing that a community did to try and exile Mark, to destroy him and destroy his ministry and reputation. Now, don't get me wrong, Mark is not some sort of lily-white innocent saint. He's as depraved as the rest of us. But what happened was wrong, and the people that were taking him down were doing so almost anonymously in the midst of this group. It's sad, it split things apart. I had 4 friends lose their jobs, not in Mark's community, lose their jobs outside the community because they were associated with him. No, human beings, when they get in a group, they fall short. We can call it human finitude, or we can call it total depravity. The seeds are there. But you know what's worse than all of that? We think it's a static condition. We think it's the way human beings are and always will be. And that has a way of, it's kind of letting us off the hook. We don't look to shift and change. I mean, I know that there are neurological and reasons why these things are happening. It's the way the brain works. It's the way our mirror neurons work with people. There are all kinds of reasons for it. But we think it's a static condition. Not the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John does not think it's a static condition, because the Gospel sees the Logos as an active and dynamic creative word, moving ever closer to beauty and perfection. That's what's being talked about in this prologue, this dynamic word, enfleshed in the Son of God, it says. Now, the reason he wrote the story was not to tell us that Jesus, the Son of God, the Logos, was cool. And it wasn't even to tell us that if we could just give intellectual assent to that notion, that we would then get to go to heaven. Nothing like that. No, he had something very different in mind, and you can tell by the most important phrase in this prologue. This is a little Bible study, but we're going to do it anyway. Even if I tell my students, you really shouldn't do that in sermons. When the ancients would write, they didn't always write according to the kind of outline that we use. We use, Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3, and then maybe some points A, and, little Roman numeral, we have that kind of, they don't do that. They do something called a chiasm. It's a little easier to remember if it's not written. So the beginning of a piece covers the same theme as the end of the piece. And then the second thing in the piece, the second to last thing in the piece. And that's the way the prologue of John is written. So let's look at how that plays. Starts with the Word was with God, and then the only begotten Son was with God. Creation was through the Word, and grace and truth was through the Word Jesus. Received life, received grace. John the Baptist, doesn't it seem odd when that John the Baptist thing comes in? Well, it fits if you look at this chiasm. Response to the incarnation. His own, that is Israel, his own, that is believers. Accept the Logos, that is to say, entrust the name or the reality of that active word, that creative moment. And if you can accept that, believe that, work with that reality, well, then the real point comes. You are given power to become children of God, and that is why John wrote this gospel. He wants everyone to know, not that Jesus is cool, but that the Son of God, the Logos, is moving towards ever-expressive beauty. And if we accept that reality, we're given power to express that love and creative power as well. All through his gospel, that's what he's about. Pretty amazing. You know what that's saying? That's saying that the Logos, the creative power of God, is not only acting upon us, it is being expressed through us. You, every one of you, has the power to be part of God's creative move in the world. Every one of you has the ability to work on the human condition and to impact the society around us so that we in fact grow and develop rather than being stuck in a place where we cannot love, where we tear one another down in the anonymity of a crowd. Obviously, many other examples. But that's the excitement that John feels in this gospel. That's what we're believing in, not giving intellectual assent to something that happened 2,000 years ago. No, this is the reality. Can we entrust our lives to that? All through this gospel, in fact, 14 times, Jesus talks about the way. The way was the first thing Christians were called. They were people of the way before they were Christians. And we're going to talk over the next months about what that way is. I can give you the outlines. It has to do with connecting to the presence of God, seeking the presence of God, because you see, one of the things that happens in our life is that we reject God's opinions, God's perspective on things, and take our own. I mean, the liberals have rejected God entirely, it seems, and the conservatives have co-opted God's word, saying they know what they think it means. But both very often decide that they have the authority over what it is that God's doing. So we connect to God, we pay attention to God, and we trust that the Logos, the creative word, the power is working through us. We can in fact grow. We can in fact heal the world. And as we do, as we are drawn towards the perfection that God has for us, we will find that God's love is waiting for us patiently, longing for us to become whole and a reflection of God's love.